We've just listened to the story from John's Gospel of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus was a great friend of Jesus, and we can see the humanity of Jesus coming across so strongly. We also listened to a first reading from Ezekiel, where Ezekiel offers hope to a people, where he compares them to dry bones and he pours life into them again. My earliest entry into acting was in a primary school pageant. Most of my outings at school concerts prior to this were silent, as I was usually selected as part of the Irish dancing display. Kilt, knee socks, school blazer, and a piece of cloth over my shoulder, filled in with a tara brooch, as I took to the boards and let loose to the rhythms of Irish music. The speaking part came about in my final year. I was in a school pageant. The early 70s saw a rush of pageants that were spurred on by the 50th anniversary of our nation in 1966. The one we brutalised was called Cunal Cearnach or Canuck Calvary. Basically, it told the story of one of Nafina who left Ireland in search of the person of whom people were hearing great rumours about, namely Jesus. Leave it to an Irishman though. He gets there in time for the funeral. Anyway, my part was a one-liner. This time I had no kilt, no knee socks or tara brooch, just a pair of sandals, and I was wrapped in one of my mother's good white sheets. My line remains emblazoned in my brain, soul, heart, or wherever one puts these things, in an Laurence Olivier-like fashion. It was addressed to Colonel Cearnach, and it went like this: I was dead, and now I live. Lazarus, come forth, the Nazarene said. Yes, my stage debut was as Lazarus. And unlike Lazarus, who came back from the dead, my acting career died on that night. However, I have to bow to the superior empathy of a lady who relayed the story of Lazarus to me many years later when I was a teacher. Relating the story, it went along these lines. A fella came running up to Jesus and said, Jesus, you better come quick. Lazarus is dead. And Jesus said, Jesus, he's not. And he was bursting and crying because Jesus and Lazarus are great pals. And when Jesus got to where Lazarus was buried, and it took ages because there were no buses or anything then, when he got there and he shouted, Lazarus, come here. And Lazarus came out and they were all delighted. A thoroughly Dublin pageant. The gospel reading and the first reading today are full of images that we are regrettably used to seeing or hearing about in our daily lives. Bandages, tombs, bones and sickness are the words of this era of COVID-19. The only detail that might be missing is maybe that Lazarus died of an infectious disease, or Ezekiel would tell us that people were raised because they found a vaccine. But if we dig a bit deeper, there is a bit more to these readings than the rather pessimistic words I've just trotted out. Let's start with Ezekiel. This reading was set at a time of exile for the people. A bit like the Irish who are caught in Peru at the moment. Their homeland is far away and they wonder, will they ever return to it? The people in exile were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon for 48 years. Let's hope the Peruvian exile is a lot shorter, and let's not even go there with the lockdown. Exile was described to me by the theologian James Allison as collapsing temples and emerging prophets. Let me explain. Not unlike today, the things of certainty, stability, and order were taken from the people. The things of the temple that ordered our coming and going are no longer in place, so our days fall apart. I suppose we never really realized how much of our day is ordered for us. Maybe we have a schedule at the moment keeping us busy as we are working from home, or maybe we're totally lost in boredom and disappointment. The temples of the workplace and education write our schedules and hence our lives. Those in the biblical exile were forced into a form of slavery and made to do things that, if they had a choice, they'd prefer not to do. The control that they once had over their futures was gone. Everything that was central was gone. And so in exile, with the loss of structure and organization, the exile turned to poet, to priest, and to prophet. And thus the phrase, collapsing temples, emerging prophets. Turning to the poet, priest, or prophet of old is not unlike the way we jump on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or even a phone call to a wise friend to find something, to find some way of understanding it all. It is difficult to understand these days, and that is not something to be surprised by. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur says, we can often live in times of limited expressions, where our conventional ways of talking and describing things are totally inadequate. At this stage, we too could be running out of words. We may have reached the limit of our understandings and we can't find poet, priest, or prophet to help us. Maybe we've even grown tired of all the COVID-19 jokes. What the scholars tell us about exile might help us move forward ever so slightly. Walter Brueggemann tells us that there were three main threads of thought that ran through the writings. Firstly, people said that exile was a well-deserved punishment. Others said it was the same as death. And thirdly, others, while in exile, created a stunningly refreshing idea of what the future might be. There are many today who say that we deserve the COVID-19 virus, that we'd lost the run of ourselves, that it's a punishment for our arrogance and complacency. As my mother would say, they've lost the run of themselves, child. Secondly, there are many who see this present exile and lockdown as death. I think of some of you listening who are in hospital or are working in hospital, and maybe it's hard for you to think of anything else. For some of us who aren't on the front line, we may only see what is lost, and we are like the living dead, so to speak. We have become what we cannot do, or at least there are moments when we slip into that way of being. The pubs and restaurants are gone, the hairdresser and barber is inaccessible, and the routes are beginning to appear. I can't get near the place I always walk in. Maybe I'm on my own, I can't cope with the isolation. Or maybe I'm with people, even family, I love them, but, and I could go on and we could go on. The third option is the one that is most life-giving, and the evidence from those in historical exile has proven this to be true. The option is to sing against the present reality and to dance towards a future that we don't even know yet. Don't be overcome by the theory that this is a punishment or this is a death. Make it about a future as yet not revealed. That's what today's gospel is about, unbinding ourselves to prepare for something new and even greater. New ways of relating, new ways of being a society, new economic purposes, and new ways of being church. I remind you of my first words on stage. Come forth, the Nazarene said, or in some simple Dublinese, Lazarus, come here. How delighted we'd all be if the future was ours now, but we have to be patient, as our duty is to protect and care. A future will be ours, but not yet. But we can begin to dream and to create it. If I was to find any words that help me focus at present, they're the words of a 16th century lady, Saint Teresa of Avila. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing away. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. In conclusion, let us aspire not to see our present predicament of lockdown as a punishment or as a death, but merely a space where we can create a future. If you notice, the hymns of exile, they don't just recount a past. The best hymns, one of which we listen to at the end of Mass, always sets us up for a future. They are not nostalgia for the past. They are nutrients for the soul and food for the future. Lazarus was cocooned, bound up, and restricted. He was set free. He would eventually have to face the ultimate moment of death, and Jesus promised both him and us that that is even not the end. But if we were unbound from our present predicaments, what would we do with our time? What would we do with our lives? What would we do with our opportunities? Those that survived exile had an idea as to what they would do when exile was over. Those who were unbound from exile flourished if they knew what flourishing was. The great theologian of hope is Jürgen Moltmann. He was studying science and maths until 1944 when he was drafted into the German army. He was nearly killed in the Hamburg bombings of 1943. When he joined the army, he surrendered to the first British soldier he met and spent the years between 1945 and 1948 as a prisoner of war, firstly in Belgium, then in Northern England, and finally Scotland. I finish with his words. Hope is more than a feeling. Hope is more than an experience. Hope is more than foresight. Hope is a command. Obeying it means life, survival, endurance, standing up to life until death is swallowed up in victory. Let us pray.